Hey there, what's up? It's me again, and it's been a while, hasn't it? I decided to take a break over the months to find my footing on this channel, and I feel like this video is the perfect one to end my hiatus. If you don't know, I've kind of been invested in the fan-made Fanganronpa stories, Fanganronpas for short, which try to tell a Fanganronpa killing game on their own. Usually with an original cast as well, though there are some instances where they use pre-established characters from other franchises. Even though I'm kinda mixed on the Danganronpa fandom as a whole, I really do enjoy how creativity and storytelling is put more into the spotlight, and I honestly wish more fandoms would value fanfiction and original characters like this. That being said, while I do enjoy watching these fan stories unfold, I have seen a couple writing pitfalls that many fangans fall into. Which makes sense, considering that a lot of these stories are made by beginning writers, sometimes even being children, so you really shouldn't expect something on the same level as a AAA video game like Danganronpa made by a team of professionals. Even so, I thought it would be a fun video talking about the various pet peeves I have in these stories, as well as give some helpful advice along the way.
Wait a minute! How can you, a subpar YouTuber with no creative writing experience, give Fanganronpa advice when you haven't even made a Fanganronpa yourself? Well, you see, straw man I just made up, you're completely right.
However, I have been, attempting to make a Fanganronpa comic of my own, which probably isn't even gonna come out, don't get their hopes up, guys. And by doing so, I feel like I've learned a lot about what it takes to be a creative writer and how there's a world of difference between talking about how your story is going to unfold and actually having to write that story. Needless to say, writing is hard. Oh, and also I'm not gonna reference any specific stories in this video, as I don't want any negativity or harassment coming to these creators from this video. I only used Stora from Super Danganronpa Another 2 for this thumbnail, so people clicking on the video would know it's about Fanganronpas, and I have nothing against the series whatsoever. I want this video to inspire creativity, much like how writing Fangans has inspired me to write my own characters' story, even if it potentially never sees the light of day. So, without further ado, let's begin. The first kind of pet peeve I have with a lot of Fanganronpas is when they try to get to the exciting parts of Danganronpa, such as the motive announcement, the body discovery, the trial, etc., while ignoring parts that may be considered as filler. I perfectly understand where the sentiment comes from. When you look back on Danganronpa, you only really remember the moments that stuck out to you, but when you neglect some of the downtime moments where characters just hang out, at the points where characters die or get revealed as murderers feel more empty as you never really got a chance to know them on a personal level. This is actually a common criticism of the anime adaptation to Trigger Happy Havoc, which tried to tell the 25-hour story in only a quarter of that time, and by doing so, only really goes through the motions of the story without delving in deeper. I've kind of experienced this issue myself when making my story, and I feel like I found two ways to remedy this issue. One is to not only have more subplots relating to the characters and or mystery of your series, but also have every single character do at least something throughout the course of the story. Whether it be making friends with someone else, going through a character arc, or even coming up with ways to manage the killing game, thinking about things this way kind of forces you to come up with various unique side plots that you can insert into the daily and deadly lives of your fangun. Not only developing all your characters, but also adding some intrigue to your plot as well. I noticed that every Danganronpa character has done something outside the killing game to either enhance the plot or enhance their own character, so if we do that with our own cast, we can make them much more memorable. Another way I feel like I manage this is by setting up a little calendar in your outline showing how many days have passed, both in the game overall and in the specific chapter, such as day 6, which would be day 3 of chapter 2. Danganronpa tends to have 3 to 5 days per chapter, with the exception of chapter 5, so try writing your story with that day limit in mind, and like with the characters, you should have each of these days do something to the story, even when the motive hasn't been announced yet. Again, doing this kind of forces you to come up with side plots and ways to move the story along without jumping straight into the motive and victim reveal. Speaking of which, keep in mind that Monokuma-induced motives tend to take days before a murder actually occurs, as the cast tends to get wary whenever a Monokuma tries to get them to kill. This isn't always the case, but I feel like it's something to take note of regardless. One more way to fix this issue is by looking at Trigger Happy Havoc and its anime counterpart. See what kinds of things the anime left out and why doing so makes the story weaker. By analyzing the source material like this, you can better understand what you need to add in your story to make it more effective. In fact, I did the same thing for writing one of my class trials, and I noticed that my trial felt less like a group discussion to see who the killer is, and more like a one-on-one conversation between Rantaro, oh yeah, Rantaro's the protagonist, and the wrong person who's the killer and wrong, so Rantaro, the god of wisdom himself, has to destroy the murderer with facts and logic, and then everyone gangs up on the killer for no reason, other than the fact that the almighty protagonist suspected— oh jeez, I kinda went on a tangent there, oops. Anyway, yeah, you should try to look at the original Danganronpa games for reference on pacing and tone. Speaking of tone, another pet peeve I have with a lot of Fanganronpas is the tone, or more specifically, the tone's lack of dread. A lot of Fanganronpas I've watched, my draft included, have this issue where characters don't really treat death and murder with the severities those topics really hold. When a character dies, the characters only feel mildly sad, with no sense of fear or dread, and when a character is revealed to be a murderer, the other cast members are way too forgiving and don't really process the fact that this person murdered another, even with the conditions of the killing game. Again, I understand where this is coming from. When you're invested in the Danganronpa series and 70% of your cast is either dead or a murderer, you kinda get used to the idea of death, at least in the Danganronpa series, so it doesn't really hold as much weight to you as it did when you first played it. However, one of the reasons why Danganronpa works so well is because it twists the human fear of death into something both beautiful and disturbing. It's why you hear the word despair so much. This feeling of despair is essential to the series. So, how do you add despair to the series? My best advice for this is to either picture yourself in a deadly scenario or watch other media relating to murder just to remind you how horrific murder and death could be, so that you can write your characters and tone with that horror in mind. Watching Squid Game reminded me of the sheer brutality of death, and there's even a character who kills people to save themselves and others, kinda like a killer you would find in Danganronpa. Also remember that, even with more sympathetic block-ins, each murder is essentially a trolley problem that some people would find morally objectionable. I'm not saying that you shouldn't make sympathetic murders, I enjoy them too, it's one of the reasons why I love Danganronpa, but just remember that these people are still murderers, and consider the effects that murder entails. Speaking of which, it's time to talk about the murder mysteries of these fangans, and I have a couple things to talk about them. Before I do though, I want to state that, from experience, writing murder mysteries is hard. With a murder mystery, you essentially have to create two different stories that both make sense and connect to each other, and it's a fine balance between creating a puzzle that is solvable, yet challenging. It's certainly an ambitious task for beginning writers to not only make one, but 6 different mysteries in one story. This is to say that, while I see various flaws to said mysteries, it's understandable from a beginner or even intermediate perspective. These things happen as the murder mystery is a difficult genre to write, especially in the way Danganronpa handles it with the class trials. Okay, now that that's out of the way, one pet peeve I have about these trials is that there tends to be a lack of any serious red herrings that lead the viewer astray. Now, I do see that these fangans tend to have a false suspect, but it's usually only one of them, and they either typically don't appear suspicious at all, or that they're so suspicious that it's obvious that they aren't the culprit. The Danganronpa series tends to have around 3 false suspects per case with some exceptions, and oftentimes these suspects do something worthy of hiding, making them actually suspicious. An example of such a red herring would be that it turns out that Larry was awake at the time of the murder. That seems pretty suspicious. However, the reason why Larry snuck in at such a late time was to meet with his secret lover. Ooh, how interesting. One... That was the most unenthused... Ooh, how interesting. One good way I found to make effective red herring is by making side plots. In the trial, have the other characters do things while the murder is occurring, including the victims themselves. Then, the effects of their actions relating to the subplot will appear in the form of misleading pieces of evidence. Not only do subplots add complexity to the mystery by adding false clues leading to the wrong direction, but it also helps develop more characters, especially if they're the victim who won't be able to be fleshed out again. Think about all of the victims who really got their moment in the spotlight after they died, especially in the earlier chapters where they don't get much screen time. For the red herrings that aren't dead, I would suggest that the subplot they go through should be something that the suspect would reasonably lie about, whether it be the time and place they are at would make them look like the culprit, or that they're hiding a personal secret of theirs. There's this really good piece of writing advice I heard on a YouTube video that states that every suspect of a crime should be lying about something. If everyone who's innocent tells the truth, then whoever doesn't is automatically the murderer, which just isn't fun. If you play Ace Attorney, this is also the reason why the witnesses constantly commit perjury for no reason. Now that we've talked about the suspects, it's time to talk about the big, bad, blackened, and a specific pet peeve I have about them. In a lot of fangans I've seen, whenever the protagonist first suspects someone of being the true murderer, the case practically ends. All that happens now is one of those argument-armament sequences and boom, the trial's over. I feel like the reason why this happens is because, since the viewer already knows who the true killer is, there's nothing else to be solved. However, you can't just figure out who the true killer is. You also have to convince everyone else that this person is the one who done it. In fact, the killer from the first class trial was revealed around the halfway point of the trial, so how do you do this? Well, think about this. When you first accuse a character of murder, usually it's just that, an accusation. Not many people are going to believe you just on your word alone, so you provide evidence. However, that's just a single piece of evidence, and while a few people may hop onto your side, there's also plenty of possibilities that could have that piece of evidence exist while your suspect remains innocent. So, you provide more evidence, people question it, and the process repeats until there's nothing that could possibly explain the culprit's innocence. There's just too much evidence that points to them being the culprit. Remember, in a class trial, people's lives are on the line, so if they're going to vote on someone being the killer, they better be certain that they're actually the blackened. One more thing I want to add, and this is something I've experienced when writing for a class trial, is to remember that the class trial is a group discussion. Like I said before, when I had my true killer be revealed, it felt more like a one-on-one conversation between my protagonist and the killer, with the side characters only providing funny quips and roasts along the way. It made the side characters feel useless to the story, like when I'm writing the script, I think, oh yeah, I forgot this character was here. Gotta add their lines so people don't forget like I did. So yeah, make sure to have the cast bring up points in the trial as well, especially when the true killer is accused. The killer isn't the only one who brings up points to defend their innocence. Sometimes people are initially going to be on their side, and other times people will just ask a question about the case that they are unsure of, to which you provide evidence that helps them realize who the killer is. Again, if no one believed the killer, then the trial would already be over, which just isn't realistic. So that's all the advice and nitpicks I have when it comes to writing some of the Fanganronpas, but I also want to give some general advice on the production of a Fanganronpa as well, as I believe doing so can further help aspiring creators put their ideas out into the world. This video is meant to inspire creativity after all. So my first piece of advice, and probably my most important, is that when you want to make a Fanganronpa, try to do as much as you can by yourself before starting a team. Oftentimes, I see many aspiring fan creators create a cool new idea for a Fanganronpa, hire tons of voice actors, artists, programmers, etc. But then a couple months later, the project crashes and burns because there's nothing to work on, teammates are arguing how to handle the project, and people quit because, again, there's nothing to work on because the project has only been conceived a couple months ago and the first draft hasn't even begun. Okay, I may be exaggerating a little bit there, but the point is that a lot of projects tend to fail because the creator either hired the staff way too early in production, or the creator is too reliant on their staff without bringing much to the table to themselves. This doesn't just apply to Fanganronpas, it applies to all projects. It's why so many crowdfunding campaigns fail. People who lack the expertise needed to make a project on their own believe that money can solve all their issues, and that they can just hire the people needed to complete the things that they can't. However, doing so means that you can only complete your project if you meet your monetary goal. And even if you have all the money you need, directing, leading, and financial management are skills in of itself, and it's quite difficult to lead something you don't have any expertise in. That's why almost every cartoon creator is experienced in art and animation, even if they don't do the animating themselves. In order to prevent this, I first suggest to play to your strengths so that you'll be able to complete most, if not all, of your project by yourself if you have the time. Are you a programmer? Try making a fan game on RPG Maker or Unity. Are you an artist? Try making a webcomic or an Fanganronpa, which, for the uninformed, is a series of images meant to resemble Fanganronpa gameplay that is hosted on the site Instagram, and occasionally as a YouTube series. Can't program or draw? Try making a fanfiction where you can later commission CGs for, but it's not necessary to the completion of the project. Doing this will not only ensure that the fate of your project is in your hands, it also saves you a lot of money if you choose to hire people. If you really feel like you need to add an element to your project, try learning the skill on your own before trying to hire someone else. Of course, you can't do everything by yourself. Certain aspects, like voice acting and, to an extent, artists, editors, and programmers, sometimes have to be hired in order to complete the project depending on its size. All I'm saying is that you should try to get as much as you can by yourself and only resort to hiring/recruiting others if it's absolutely necessary. And when you do recruit for help, wait until you have a tangible product, either having the final script for your entire fangan or the final script for at least the prologue in the entirety of Chapter 1, and potentially the first draft for everything else. That way, your team members can have something to work on while you work as well. Speaking of work, another piece of advice I'd like to give is that if there's any part of the Fanganronpa making process that seems too difficult or daunting for you to do, don't be afraid to simplify it. For example, the average Fanganronpa character tends to have around 5 poses, and that's not even counting all the sprites with different facial expressions with the same pose. So even if a single artist were to replicate this aspect of Fanganronpa, it would have to make over 240 individual drawings for the entire cast, which is incredibly daunting if you're an artist, and incredibly expensive if you aren't. So, instead of trying or paying to do all that work, you could try lightening the load by decreasing the amount of poses by a significant amount. One really good example of this would be the Your Turn to Die series, in which each character is given a default pose that is unique and expresses each character's personality, and isn't just them standing and looking directly in the screen. That way, Nangadai can allow for these characters to be equally as expressive without having to draw as many key poses. For example, Joe Tazuna only has 2 key poses, and the rest of the sprites are just a difference in facial expression, which is a lot easier to manage as an artist. Some characters, like Jin, only has 1 pose, and all the changes are with the face, head, and arms. By cutting corners like this, the amount you have to draw becomes a lot more manageable, such as 32 to 80 poses for the entire cast, which is far less than the 240 we initially had. If you're worried that doing this will make your project seem less like Fanganronpa as a whole, keep in mind that the series was made by a team of professionals, so don't feel bad that you don't meet that high of a standard. But besides, a lot of Fanganronpa fans don't really mind if your project lacks something from the canon games. Not that they don't appreciate it if you do have them, I mean I certainly do. It's just that the thing Fanganronpa fans appreciate the most is a fun story, and as long as you can provide that, then they don't mind if you don't have the other aspects of the series. So, there we have it. Those were my personal pet peeves and pieces of advice for Fanganronpas, both in terms of writing and production.
Wait a minute! You haven't talked about the personal nitpicks yet! Yeah, where's the nitpicks?
Okay. Too many actual advice, so let's turn our brains up. You know what? It's time for a nitpick roundup! I'm using the same, buddy. Discovery sound! Looking at you, Henry. I don't understand why characters in other media have ultimate talents. It doesn't make any sense. Ultimate talents. Translate to super high school level. Ultimate talents. It's meant for prodigies. It's not super. So it doesn't make any sense for people who aren't in high school or college to use them. Okay, but seriously, if you follow any of these nitpicks I listed, that's perfectly fine. I was just listing the general things that personally... Wait a minute. Whips my nays. And aren't actually anything faulty with the work itself. Even when it comes to the pet peeves I do find faulty, don't feel bad if you ever fall into them. Remember, these things are either made by solo developers or small teams consisting of beginners and or hobbyists, and discouraging people from making their passion projects is the last thing I want to do. Anyway, I hope this video helps you in the production of your potential Fanganronpa, or at the very least informs and entertains you. Make sure to fuel me with endless comments of praise, and hopefully I'll see you in at least a faster time than my hiatus. Well, now then, time for me to crawl back into the cave of loneliness. Peace out!